Michael had not planned on wearing the suit that night. It had been hanging in the back of his closet for 3 years, pressed into the dark behind his work shirts and Emma's old winter coats. And when he pulled it out on the evening of her 8th birthday, the fabric still smelled faintly of the dry cleaner's chemicals and something older beneath that, something that belonged to a different version of his life. He held it up in the bathroom mirror for a long moment, turning it slightly under the yellow light, and told himself it still fit well enough. It did not fit perfectly. The shoulders had grown a little loose, and there was a small crease at the left lapel that no amount of pressing had been able to erase. But he put it on anyway, because his daughter deserved a father who showed up looking like he had tried. And because the restaurant she had asked for, the one her mother had circled on a map of downtown 3 years ago, when Sarah was still alive, and life still moved forward, like something expected, deserved at least that much from him. Emma waited by the door, in a dress the color of lavender. She had picked it herself from a rack at a second-hand shop 2 Saturdays ago, and she had been careful with it since, wearing it only in her room, only to practice. She stood very straight when Michael came down the stairs. And she looked at him the way she had learned to look at him after Sarah died, with a brightness in her eyes that was partly real and partly offered, as if she had made a private agreement with herself to be cheerful for him, because somebody had to be. She was 8 years old, and already she understood how to carry things quietly. Michael straightened his tie, looked at her standing there in her lavender dress, and felt the particular kind of love that has no clean word for it, the love that lives right alongside grief and does not try to push it away. He had been saving for 2 months. Not a great deal of money by most measures, but for a man who repaired air conditioning units across the city for a living, who drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, who had renegotiated his rent twice in the last year and skipped buying new work boots for another season for that man. 2 months of careful saving meant something. It meant he could take his daughter to La Maison Dorée on her birthday, to the restaurant her mother had wanted to visit, to the place Sarah had pointed to on that map and said, "Someday, when things settle down, we'll go there together." Things had not settled down the way Sarah meant them to, but Michael had found another way to keep the promise anyway. The drive downtown took 40 minutes through traffic, and Emma sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city lights blur past the window. She did not talk much on the drive. Michael watched her in the rearview mirror and noticed the way she pressed her lips together sometimes, the way her eyes went somewhere interior and private. He knew what she was thinking about. He had learned to recognize the particular quality of her silences by now, the way certain ones belonged to ordinary boredom and certain others belonged to her mother. This one belonged to her mother. But Emma did not say anything, and Michael did not say anything either. And when they pulled up to the restaurant, she looked out at the warm gold light spilling through the tall glass windows and said, very quietly, "Daddy, Mare would have liked this, wouldn't she?" Michael put the truck in park. He kept his hands on the steering wheel for a moment. He said, "Yeah, baby, she really would have." The host at the front of La Maison Dorée was a young man in a dark vest who looked at Michael and Emma with an expression of polite neutrality that contained, if you looked closely, something slightly off, a small recalibration of expectation, a nearly invisible adjustment in his posture. He checked the reservation twice. He asked if Michael had requested the booth or the table. Michael said he had not specified. The host led them through the dining room, past tables of well-dressed couples and a large party celebrating something in the back, and seated them near the window at a round table with a white cloth and 2 tall candles, and a menu that was leather-bound and heavy, and did not list prices on the children's insert. The chair across from Michael sat empty. It was an ordinary thing, an empty chair at a table, but in that room, at that moment, it felt like something being stated. Michael set his jacket on the back of his own chair, helped Emma settle into hers, and smiled at his daughter across the candlelight. He did not look at the empty chair if he could help it. He looked at Emma. He thought, "We are here. We made it. This is enough." A few minutes after they were seated, the waiter, a tall man with a practiced smile and a silver pen, came to the table with water and bread, and the question Michael had not quite been prepared for. "Good evening, sir. And will the other member of your party be joining you?" The silence lasted only a second. Michael said, "No. It's just the 2 of us tonight." The waiter nodded and moved away. and Emma was already looking at the breadbasket. And Michael let himself breathe again. The couples at the surrounding tables had begun to notice them by the time the appetizers were considered. Not all of them, not obviously, but Michael had grown up in a world where noticing happened through the corners of eyes, through the angle of a turned shoulder, through the brief arrest of conversation at an adjacent table. He had been noticed his whole life in various ways for various reasons, and he had learned to feel it even when he was trying not to. The table to his left held a couple in their 50s. The woman in a silk blouse, the color of champagne, and the man with silver cufflinks that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. They had not spoken to each other in the 10 minutes since Michael and Emma sat down, and yet when the woman leaned toward her husband and murmured something, her gaze moved just for a moment in the direction of Michael's table. He did not hear what she said. He did not need to. He had heard similar things before. There was a grammar to these rooms that had nothing to do with French menus or the correct fork for the salad course. It was a grammar written in the invisible ink of old money and inherited confidence, and Michael had never been taught it. And the people around him had been fluent in it since birth. He did not resent them for it. He had tried resentment in the years before Emma came along and found it a poor fuel. It burned hot and fast and left nothing useful behind. What he felt instead was something more precise and more tiring. The awareness of being assessed, being filed, being placed, without appeal, into a category that the room had already decided on before he sat down. He straightened his spine and looked at the menu, and reminded himself that he had as much right to be here as anyone, and that this was true even when the room seemed to vote otherwise. Emma was studying the menu with the kind of focus she usually reserved for her schoolwork, jaw set, eyes moving carefully down each column. Michael watched her and felt the familiar dual awareness he carried everywhere, pride in his daughter and anxiety about the numbers at the bottom of the page. The cheapest entree was $38. The children's pasta was $24. He could manage it. He had planned for it. But there was a gap between being able to manage something financially and the feeling of sitting in a room full of ease and plenty, and knowing that each number on the menu represented a calculation he had made quietly in advance, alone, before leaving the house. Emma looked up from the menu and met his eyes, and he could see in her expression that she had been doing her own quiet math. She set the menu down and said, very casually, "I'm not that hungry. Actually, maybe I'll just get the soup," Michael said, without missing a beat. "Order whatever you want. It's your birthday." Emma looked at him. She said, "Okay, I kind of want the pasta." He said, "Then get the pasta." She smiled at him, the real smile, not the offered one, and he felt himself settle a degree. The man at the table near the bar was heavy-set and loud, and on his third glass of something amber. He had arrived with a group of business associates who seemed to be collectively deciding whether to find him entertaining or embarrassing, and the consensus had not yet been reached. He had been talking loudly for some time about a deal that had fallen through, about a competitor who deserved worse than he had gotten, about things that seemed to matter a great deal to him, and not at all to the room. And then, for reasons known only to the particular gravity of cruelty that alcohol sometimes frees in people, his attention drifted and landed on Michael. He did not say anything immediately. He just looked. Then he leaned toward the man beside him and said, "Loud enough to carry." "You think his wife left him, or the other way around?" The man beside him gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. A few other tables went quiet. Michael's hand, resting on the tablecloth, closed very slowly into a loose fist. Emma had heard it. He could tell by the way her eyes went still. She was looking at her pasta bowl, and her expression had gone neutral in the careful way of a child who has learned to make herself invisible when something painful passes through the air. The door of La Maison Dorée was a heavy mahogany thing with a brass handle that the staff kept polished to a soft gleam. And when it opened at 8:17 that evening, no one in the dining room looked up immediately. Doors opened constantly in a restaurant. It was not an event, but the manager, a meticulous man named Gerald, who had worked at this establishment for 11 years and who prided himself on a memory for faces, looked up from the reservation podium and went very still. The woman who had entered was perhaps 45, though she carried herself in a way that made age feel like a category that did not quite apply to her. She wore a black dress that was simple in the way that only very expensive clothes manage to be simple. No ornament, no excess. Nothing that drew the eye except the fact of the dress itself. She wore no jewelry that was visible. Her hair was dark and pulled back, and her face had the quality of a landscape that has weathered things and is not diminished by it. She stood at the entrance for a moment and scanned the room, not in the searching way of someone looking for a table, but in the measured way of someone taking inventory. The manager started toward her immediately. The woman's gaze moved across the room in a slow, unhurried arc. And then it stopped. It stopped at Michael's table. Specifically, it stopped at the empty chair. She looked at the empty chair for a moment, and then she looked at Emma, who was arranging her silverware the way she always did when she was trying to appear unbothered. The woman's expression did not change dramatically, but something shifted in it, a small, precise movement, the way a compass needle moves when it comes close to something magnetic. She began to walk toward the table. The manager, Gerald, was already behind her. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low and the urgency in it professional, "we have the private dining room prepared for you this evening. Everything is exactly as you specified." The woman did not stop walking. She said without turning around, "Thank you, Gerald." In a moment, she reached Michael's table and paused. She looked at the empty chair, and then she looked at Michael, and her expression now was something impossible to name, precisely thoughtful and careful, and carrying some private weight that had nothing to do with him. She said, "I hope I'm not being presumptuous. Would you mind very much if I sat here for a while?" The room feels. She paused. "Full," she finished, which was not quite the word she had started with, but Michael understood what she meant. He looked at Emma. Emma was looking at the woman with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude. Michael said, "Not at all. Please." The woman pulled out the empty chair and sat down. Her name, she said, was Victoria Hale. She offered it the way people offer things they do not consider important, simply and without elaboration. And she did not add a title or a company or a context. Michael told her his name, and Emma told her hers. And Emma added, without being asked, "It's my birthday today. I'm 8. Victoria Hale looked at Emma with an expression that seemed to cost her something, a brief, controlled flicker of something that moved through her face and was gone before it fully arrived. She said, 8 is a very good age." Emma considered this seriously and said she thought so too. Victoria ordered water and a small plate of something from the menu, and she ate it without apparent concern for the opinions of the room. She asked Emma questions: what grade she was in, whether she liked her school, what her favorite subject was. Emma said reading and math, roughly equally, which made Victoria nod with what appeared to be genuine approval. She asked Michael how long they had lived in the city. He said most of his life. She asked what he did. He told her air conditioning repair and maintenance, commercial and residential, primarily on the north and east sides of downtown. He said it the way he always said it in situations like this. Simply, without apology. Because the apology had never been required in his own mind, and he had decided long ago not to offer it to anyone else's. Victoria received the information without any of the micro-expressions of recalibration that he had learned to watch for. She simply nodded and said that it was essential work. He said, evenly, that it paid the bills. She said, without any particular weight, that most essential work did not. And he was quiet for a moment, and then said, that was true. Emma grew more talkative as the dinner went on, the way she did when she felt safe. She told Victoria about her teacher, whose name was Mrs. Patterson, who gave too much homework but was also kind when you were having a hard day. She told her about her friend Rosie and the project they were building together about the phases of the moon. And then, in the way that children arrive at things, she said, without preamble, "My mom died when I was 5. That's her chair." She gestured at the seat Victoria was sitting in. Victoria went very still. Emma continued, "We came here because Mom always wanted to. Daddy saved up." There was a silence at the table that had a particular texture to it, not uncomfortable, but serious. The kind of silence that respects what has just been said. Michael looked at his daughter and thought, not for the first time, that she carried things with a dignity he had spent years trying to learn. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, gently, "She must have been very loved to have a family like this one." Emma thought about it and said, "She was. We still love her." Victoria looked down at the table for a moment. When she looked up again, her eyes were very steady and very clear. But there was something behind them that Michael recognized in the way you recognize something you yourself have carried. He did not say anything about it. He simply received it. Emma, whose curiosity operated without brakes, looked at Victoria and asked, in the open, wondering way that only children manage, "Do you have any kids?" The question landed in the middle of the table, like a small stone dropped into still water. Victoria looked at Emma. The silence stretched for one beat, two, and then she said, "I did. Once." Emma said, "Oh." She seemed to understand instinctively that this was all the answer there was, and she did not ask more. What she did instead was reach across the table and put her small hand over Victoria's. It was a gesture so instinctive and so pure that it required no commentary. Victoria looked down at the small hand on hers, and something in her face moved in a way it had not moved all evening. Michael watched and did not speak. He had learned a long time ago that some moments should simply be witnessed. It was a man named Prescott who broke it. Brent Prescott, senior partner of a development firm, who had spent the better part of the evening moving between tables and shaking the hands of people he knew, which at La Maison Dorée on a Thursday night was a considerable number. He was mid-handshake when he turned and caught sight of the woman at the window table. He was the one who said it not quietly, in the way of a man managing the situation, but loudly, in the way of a man who did not yet understand that some revelations should be handled with more care. "Good Lord," he said. "Is that Victoria Hale?" He said it with his full speaking voice, carrying across 3 tables, arriving at the bar, reaching the couple in their 50s, and the heavy man with his amber drink, and the waiter with his silver pen, and the manager Gerald, who was already moving through the room with the expression of a man rehearsing an apology. The dining room went quiet in waves, the way rooms do when something larger than expected moves through them. Victoria did not look up immediately. She continued looking at Emma, and she finished the sentence she had been in the middle of. Something about the phases of the moon, and whether Emma had looked at them through a telescope. Then she turned, slowly, and looked across the room at Brent Prescott, who was standing there with his loosened tie and his wide eyes, and the beginning of an obsequious smile already forming. She gave him a single nod, the nod of someone acknowledging a fact, not a person. Then she turned back to the table. The room, however, did not turn back. The whispers ran through it like current. Victoria Hale. The name passed from table to table, and with it, the understanding that the woman who had chosen to sit at a window table with a working man and his daughter, rather than accept the private dining room, that woman was the founder and executive chair of Hale Technologies, which had recently completed its 3rd round of philanthropic investments, totaling figures most of the people in this room could read about only in newspapers. She was the woman whose charitable foundation funded environmental research across 11 countries. She was a woman who had appeared on the covers of precisely 3 publications in 10 years, always on her own terms and never without purpose. She was, as the woman in the champagne silk blouse said to her silver cuff-linked husband in a voice that had abruptly changed register entirely, not someone you expected to find sitting at a regular table ordering water and asking a child about her homework. Michael, for his part, felt the weight of the room shift the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. He looked at Victoria. She was watching him with an expression of what he could only describe as patient honesty, as though she had known this moment was coming, and had simply been waiting to see what he would do with it. He said, "You're Victoria Hale." It was not quite a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't know that." She said, "I know you didn't. That's why I sat here." He considered this. Emma was looking back and forth between them with the focused attention of a child who senses that something important is happening and is determined not to miss it. Michael said, "I don't know, behaved differently. Victoria said, "I know, that's also why I sat here." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, with a quiet honesty of his own, "I'm not sure if I should feel embarrassed." She said, "You shouldn't. This has been the realest dinner I've had in a very long time." It was the drunk man at the bar Brent Prescott's social permission apparently being read, in certain quarters, as general permission, who chose that moment to push himself up from his stool and make his way toward the window table. He was broader in person than he had seemed from across the room, and the confidence that alcohol gives a man who already has too much of it was visible in the set of his shoulders and the slight angle of his chin. He stopped a few feet from the table and looked at Michael with an expression that occupied the specific territory between contempt and amusement. He said, loud enough for the adjacent tables to hear, "So what's the plan here, friend? You think sitting next to her makes you the same kind of people?" He laughed at his own question. A few people nearby went very still. Emma had stopped eating. Michael put his hand on the table and began to push his chair back. Not because he intended anything, but because his body knew before his mind did that Emma should not be sitting here for whatever came next, and he needed her to be somewhere else, somewhere ordinary and safe, somewhere that was not this room with this man and his amber-soaked cruelty. He said to Emma, very quietly, "Baby, why don't you?" And then Victoria Hale stood up. She did not stand dramatically. She did not raise her voice. She simply set her napkin on the table and rose to her full height. And when a woman of her particular combination of bearing and accumulated consequence rises in a room, it has a specific effect on the air around her. She looked at the man, she looked at him, the way you look at something that is in your way and that you have decided to remove, and she said, "I'm sorry. I don't believe we've been introduced." The man blinked. She said, "I'm Victoria Hale." He said, "I know who you are." She said, "Then you know that I serve on the advisory board of the hospitality group that owns this property, among 4 others in this city." She said it without any particular heat, simply as information being provided to someone who required it. "And you know," she continued, with the same even tone, "that when I have an experience that falls below a certain standard at one of those properties, I tend to address it at the structural level rather than the conversational one." She held the man's gaze with total steadiness. She said, "The gentleman at this table has done nothing that does not deserve every courtesy this establishment has to offer. The same, I'm afraid, cannot be said for you." The man opened his mouth. He closed it. Gerald, the manager, had arrived at his elbow, and 2 members of the waitstaff were positioned at careful angles, and the physics of the situation had become very clear. The man said something that was not quite an apology, and not quite a retreat, and he went back to the bar. And within 4 minutes, he had collected his coat and left. The room, which had been completely silent, slowly began to breathe again. Victoria sat back down. She picked up her napkin and placed it in her lap. She looked at Emma, whose eyes were very wide, and said, "Now, I believe we were talking about the moon." Emma, after a moment, said, "The waxing gibbous phase is my favorite, because it looks like something about to be full." Victoria said, "That's a beautiful way to look at it." Michael looked at the 2 of them across the table, his daughter and this woman who had appeared from nowhere and simply sat down in the empty chair. And he felt something move through him that he had not felt in a long time, not happiness exactly, but its close neighbor, the feeling of being seen and not diminished by it. The kitchen staff had been quietly organized by Gerald, who had spent the last 20 minutes making 2 phone calls and rearranging 3 things without explaining why. And so when the lights in the dining room dimmed just slightly, the way they do in a place that knows what it is doing, and a single member of the waitstaff emerged from the kitchen carrying a small chocolate cake with 8 candles burning on it, the room understood instinctively that this was not a performance for their benefit. It was for the girl at the window table, in the lavender dress, who had told a stranger tonight that the empty chair belonged to her mother. The waiter set the cake down in front of Emma, and the candles threw warm light up across her face, and she looked at it the way children look at things that exceed their expectations, not with wildness, but with a kind of reverent hush. The room was quiet. Somewhere, someone began to hum. Michael watched his daughter close her eyes, and he watched her take a breath. And he watched her think about her wish. He did not ask what it was. He never did. Victoria sat beside him, her hands folded on the table. And she was watching Emma too, and Michael saw in her profile the particular softness of a person allowing themselves to feel something they had been avoiding for a long time. Emma blew out all 8 candles in one breath. The room applauded. Emma opened her eyes and looked across the table and said, with complete sincerity, "This is the best birthday I have ever had." Michael put his hand over his mouth for a moment. He looked at the ceiling. He looked back at his daughter. He said, "Me too. Me too." Victoria waited until Emma was absorbed in the business of the cake before she spoke to Michael. She leaned slightly toward him and said, in a quieter register, "She told me your wife's name was Sarah." He nodded. She said, "She talked about her all through dinner as though she was just in the other room." He said, "Emma thinks of her that way. I let her." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My son's name was Daniel. He was 9 when he died. Accident. It's been 7 years and I still can't go to children's birthday parties. I've paid for several, from a distance. I write checks. It's easier than attending." She said this with absolute steadiness, which told Michael something about the particular discipline it had taken to achieve that steadiness. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I know." He said, 7 years is a long time to avoid." She looked at him. She said, "You'd think so, wouldn't you?" He looked at the candles on Emma's plate, small stubs now, still warm. He said, "Does it help, the checks?" She said, after a pause, "No, I don't think it does." He said, "You came tonight, though." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I almost didn't. I sat in my car outside for 12 minutes. I was going to leave." He did not ask what had changed her mind. He thought he already knew. She had seen a little girl in a lavender dress through the tall glass windows, and something in her had stopped moving away and started moving toward instead. Before Daniel, she told him, there had been her marriage. The marriage had ended 3 years before the accident, which meant she had carried the guilt of that wrong chronology ever since, the sense that if she had been a different kind of person, a less driven and more present person, the marriage might have survived, and if the marriage had survived, certain things would have unfolded differently, and perhaps Daniel would have been somewhere else on that particular road at that particular hour. She knew this logic was circular and without foundation. She had been told so by 3 different therapists over 7 years, each one patient and credentialed and correct. Knowing a thing is irrational does not make it stop. She had built, after Daniel, a machine of productivity that was also a machine of avoidance, a company and a foundation, and a schedule that moved her from board meeting to conference call to gala, and back again without leaving spaces for the kind of stillness in which grief finds its full dimension. It had worked. It had also cost her everything that the productivity could not replace, which was, she had come to understand slowly and without quite accepting it, most of the things that mattered. Michael listened to all of this without interrupting, and without the particular expression of sympathetic distress that most people assumed was what grief required as an audience. He listened the way she imagined a person listened, who knew from their own experience that the telling of a difficult thing does not always need a response, sometimes it only needs a witness. She found, to her surprise, that this was exactly what she had needed. Victoria said, before they left, "May I ask you something?" Michael said she could. She said, "If you had everything, if tomorrow you woke up and nothing was a financial concern, what would you do first?" He thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. He said, "I'd take Emma to the ocean. She's never seen it." Then he said, after another moment, "And I think I'd go back to school. I was 2 years into an engineering program when Sarah got sick. I stopped to take care of her. I was pretty close, actually." He said it without resentment, which struck Victoria more than the fact itself. He did not say it as a complaint. He said it the way you describe the weather on a day that has already passed as a true thing, simply true. with no remaining argument about it. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Would you take my card?" He took it. He turned it over in his hands. He said, "I don't want charity, Miss Hale," she said. "I know that. I'm not offering any." He waited. She said, "I'm offering an opportunity. I have a technology and infrastructure foundation. The director of operations left last year. We've been looking for someone with field experience and engineering sensibility, and the particular kind of judgment that comes from solving problems with limited resources." She paused. "We have a program," she said, "that covers continuing education for full-time staff. It's not a favor. It's a benefit available to everyone who works there. I'm simply telling you about it because I think you might qualify for the position, and because I think you'd be good at it." Michael held the card. He looked at Emma, who was using her fork to draw a pattern in the chocolate frosting. He looked at the empty chair, which Victoria was sitting in, which was not empty anymore, which had not been empty for the last 2 hours in a way that had changed the whole shape of the evening. Emma looked up from her frosting and saw her father's expression and said, with the uncanny accuracy of a child who has been paying attention all her life, "Daddy, Mom would want you to try." The silence stretched. Michael looked at his daughter. He looked at Victoria Hale. He looked at the card in his hand. He set it on the table, very carefully, not putting it away. He said, "I'll think about it," Victoria said. "That's all I'm asking." Emma went back to her frosting. The candles were out. The room had returned to itself, the ambient hum of conversation rising back around them, the clink of glasses and the soft percussion of a functioning kitchen filtering through. Michael sat back in his chair and breathed, and for the first time in a very long time, the breathing felt uncomplicated. It felt like something a person does simply because they are alive, and alive is a thing worth being, and the evening around him, his daughter and her birthday, and this improbable woman and the city lights through the tall window felt like evidence of that. He did not call it hope, but it was shaped like it. The card stayed in his wallet for 3 days. He took it out twice, looked at it, put it back. On the 4th day, Emma found it on the kitchen table where he had left it beside his coffee cup. And she looked at it and looked at him and said, "You should call." He said he was thinking about it. She said, "You've been thinking about it for 4 days." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you have your thinking face." He said he did not have a thinking face. She said he absolutely did, and also it made him look like he needed to use the bathroom, which made him laugh, a real laugh, loud and abrupt, the kind that catches you off guard, and he reached across the table and pulled her into a hug, and she laughed too, and the kitchen was small and bright and full of morning, and he thought, this is why. This is the reason for all of it. He called that afternoon. What he had not told Emma, in the days before he called, was the specific nature of the struggle. It was not the practical concern that stopped him, although the practical concern was real. He had a steady clientele, a recognizable route, equipment that he understood, a rhythm of work that fit around Emma's school schedule and did not require him to reconfigure his entire life. The practical concern could be managed. What he kept returning to, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings after Emma was asleep, was something older and more resistant. It was the question of what it meant to accept help, not charity. Victoria had been clear, and he had believed her, but help nonetheless from someone who had the power to give it. He had spent years arranging himself around self-sufficiency the way a man arranges furniture around a wall he cannot move. It had not been stubbornness exactly. It had been, he understood, a kind of dignity that he had built from the materials available. And he had been careful with it because it was the main thing he had. And now here was an opportunity that did not require him to abandon that dignity, but that did require him to put it down for a moment and pick up something different, something that felt like trust, which was the more frightening thing by a considerable distance. He thought about Sarah. He thought about what she had said to him once. In the hospital, in a night that had carried its own particular weight. "Michael, you are the most determined person I have ever known." And you are also. She had paused and looked at him with the love that had no vanity in it. The love that only exists between people who have been through things together. You are also the most afraid to be helped. He had said he was not afraid. She had said, I know. That's the part that worries me. He had thought about that for 3 years, and understood it better now than he had then. He picked up the phone and dialed. The interview with the Hale Foundation lasted 3 hours, with 2 separate panels and a practical problem-solving exercise that Michael found himself genuinely enjoying, which surprised him and also didn't. The position was called Director of Infrastructure Operations, and it was exactly what Victoria had described. Field, heavy, technically demanding, requiring the kind of improvised judgment that no textbook teaches, but that 3 years of commercial HVAC work in a city with aging buildings and impossible deadlines will absolutely beat into you if you pay attention. The continuing education benefit was real and expansive and connected to 4 universities in the region. He was offered the position on a Friday afternoon in a conference room on the 17th floor of a building downtown, by a woman who was not Victoria Hale, but who clearly had been spoken to about him, because she looked at him with the specific respect of someone who has been given a recommendation by a source they trust completely. He called Emma's school, and she was pulled out of class briefly to take the call, which the school allowed only for significant things, and he said, I got it, Em. And Emma, 8 years old, in the hallway outside her classroom with the phone pressed to her ear, said, I knew you would, Daddy. The months that followed had the texture of something real and earned. Michael learned new systems and remembered old ones. He enrolled in an engineering completion program at the regional university on Tuesday evenings, and he sat in classrooms with people 10 years younger than him and did not feel diminished by it. He felt, if anything, that the years between had given him things you cannot get from a classroom, and that the classroom now gave him things the years could not. Emma came to his first class once, sat in the back, and colored quietly in a notebook while he took notes. Afterward, she told him that his professor seemed very smart, and also that the classroom smelled like old carpet. He said yes to both of those things. There were hard weeks. There were evenings when he came home to a quiet apartment and felt the full weight of everything he was holding: the new job's learning curve, the coursework, the management of Emma's school schedule and appointments, and the specific emotional labor of raising a child who was, by nature and by circumstance, more perceptive than most adults and required a corresponding quality of honesty in return. There were nights when he sat at the kitchen table with a textbook open and a cup of coffee gone cold and thought about the simplicity of his old life, the route he knew, the tools he understood, the particular physical satisfaction of fixing something that was broken and watching it run again. He did not regret the change. He simply needed, on those nights, to be honest with himself that it was difficult, and that difficult and right were not mutually exclusive, and that Sarah had told him something once about the difference between the life that fits comfortably and the life that fits truly. He would take a breath and pick up the pencil and go back to the work. Emma, who was developing an uncanny habit of appearing in the kitchen exactly when he needed her most, would sometimes simply come and sit beside him and do her own homework in companionable silence. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, he thought, on the better evenings, what the word family pointed toward when it was trying to describe something true. Victoria was not often in the office. She ran a large organization from a remove that was not absence but rather the particular kind of presence that trusts things to function without being watched. When she was there, she was precise and unhurried and completely attentive to whatever was in front of her. She and Michael developed a working relationship that was professional and unambiguous, and beneath that, characterized by the kind of mutual understanding that exists between people who have sat across from each other at a difficult moment and chosen honesty. They did not romanticize what had happened at La Maison Dorée. They did not narrate it to each other, or decorate it with more meaning than it had. It had simply been an evening when two people who were each carrying something alone had briefly set those things down in each other's company, and that had mattered. Emma turned 9 in the spring, and for her birthday she asked if they could go back to La Maison Dorée. Michael said, yes. He asked, the next time he saw Victoria in a meeting, whether she might want to join them. She was quiet for a moment. She said, what time? He said 7. She said she would be there. On a Thursday evening in May, Michael drove downtown in his truck, the same truck, still 200,000 miles on it, but with new boots on his feet and a different kind of ease in his chest, and parked on the side street and walked through the brass-handled door of La Maison Dorée. Gerald, the manager, saw him come in and nodded with genuine recognition, the kind that does not have to be earned twice. Michael looked across the room. There was a round table by the window, the same one, with the same white cloth and the tall candles. And at the table, already seated, were Emma in a new dress. This one, the color of the sea, and Victoria Hale, who had arrived early, who was listening to Emma explain something with animated hands. There were 3 chairs at the table. All of them were occupied. Michael stood at the edge of the dining room for a moment and let himself look at this simple, ordinary, extraordinary scene. 3 chairs. No empty one. He crossed the room, and Emma saw him coming and waved with both hands, and Victoria looked up and gave him the small, real smile of a person who has been somewhere dark and found their way back to something that resembles light. He pulled out his chair and sat down. He looked at his daughter, and the woman who had once sat in a chair that was not meant for her, and changed the shape of an evening and, it turned out, much more than that. He thought about something about a question Emma had asked him once, not long ago, while they were clearing the dinner dishes. "Daddy, do you think good things happen on purpose or just by accident?" He had thought about it. He had said, "Maybe they start as accidents, but I think you have to be the kind of person who notices them." Emma had considered this. She had said, "I think you're that kind of person." He had said, "I think you are too." The waiter arrived. He set menus on the table, and water, and a small card that said "Happy Birthday" in neat script. Emma opened the menu and studied it with the same focused seriousness she always brought to things that mattered to her. Michael looked at the candles. He looked at the window, at the lights of the city beyond the glass, at the ordinary and remarkable fact of a night that was going well. He thought about Sarah. He always thought about Sarah, and he had made his peace with the fact that he always would. He thought she would have liked Victoria. He thought she would have found the whole thing funny and improbable and right, in the way that the truest things usually are. He thought she would have said, "I told you, Michael. I told you something good was waiting." He breathed. He picked up the menu. He smiled at his daughter across the candlelight. The empty chair was gone, and the table was full, and the night was still young and long and entirely unwritten, and that felt, at last, like something very close to enough. Sometimes the person who changes your life does not arrive with any announcement. They do not carry anything that marks them as significant. They simply walk through a door and scan a room and see an empty chair and decide for reasons that are entirely their own and that have everything to do with a grief you cannot see and a kindness that has nowhere left to go to ask a quiet question. And everything that follows from that question is not magic, and it is not luck, although it looks like both. It is the consequence of 2 people each choosing, on a difficult night, to remain open to something they had not planned. It is the consequence of a little girl in a lavender dress reaching across a table and putting her small hand over a stranger's, and the stranger letting her. It is the consequence of a father who kept a promise to a woman he had lost, who brought his daughter to a restaurant she had always wanted to see, who sat in an ill-fitting suit at a round table with an empty chair and refused through everything to stop showing up. And it is the consequence of something simpler still, something that requires no philosophy and no analysis to understand, only the willingness to feel it, that kindness moves, that it does not stay in the place where it is first offered. It travels. Through the small gestures of ordinary evenings, through a hand extended over a white tablecloth, through a birthday cake carried through a quiet room, through a card left on a kitchen table for 4 days before the right moment arrives to pick up the phone. It travels through a little girl who learned from her father that grief and love are not opposites, but the same river moving in different directions, and who grew up knowing that the chair at the table is always worth keeping empty until the right person comes to fill it. The chair was empty, and then it wasn't, and the story of how it was filled turned out to be the one that mattered most.